Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and day one of NBA free agency has just wrapped up. It was ridiculous. So many names were signed. I have this massive Google Doc over here on the side of like a billion names, what teams they went to, how much money they signed for. We also had a couple of trades here and there that we'll get into in this video, some extensions that came out right at midnight for a couple players in the 2020 draft. There's a lot to get into, so I'm not going to waste too much time on this intro. If there's a player that I don't mention in this video that was signed within the first 7 hours, if they were signed before 1:16 a.m. Eastern time on the first day of free agency, hopefully I have them in this video. If I don't, comment them down below and I'll give you my thoughts on that signing. Any other players, I'm going to make more videos about free agency, so make sure to look forward to those and I'll cover those signings as they come. But yeah, let's go ahead and break down every single deal of day one of free agency. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of these videos. Let's do it. As per usual, everybody was talking about what the first deal of the day might be when free agency opened at 6 p.m. Eastern, and it ends up being Draymond Green going back to the Golden State Warriors on a 4-year, $120 million contract. Right away, I like this a lot for both sides. Draymond gets $30 million a year, which is a fantastic number for him at this stage in his career, and the Warriors get back their defensive anchor. Defense was a big up and down for them over the course of this season. When they were at home, the defense was really good. Every time they went on the road, it was a complete disaster, and I felt like Draymond was probably going to come back, even though there were teams out there, like maybe the Rockets or the Sacramento Kings, that could throw him some money and try and lure him away from Golden State. It felt impossible almost that he would get lured away from what the Warriors have done over the past few years. Him, Steph, Clay, Steve Kerr have been so successful. Why do you go ahead and break up that amazing grouping that you have over there that's had so much success in a really tough Western Conference? I think Draymond once again is going to come back and make an immediate impact on that Warriors team. He's a key cog. You couldn't let him go through the Warriors, and if you're Draymond, you have a really good situation and can get a bag. Why would you leave? To me, this is a great deal for both sides, and the Warriors are again going to be one of the best teams in the Western Conference if they can make a couple more additions. Not too long after Draymond, another big name stayed with his franchise, and that's Kyrie Irving returning to the Mavericks on a 3-year, $126 million year, so over $40 million a year for Kyrie, which makes sense. The Mavericks weren't going to let him walk after they traded a really valuable first-round pick potentially down the line over to the Brooklyn Nets midseason, as well as Dorian Finney-Smith, one of their best perimeter defenders, to bring Kyrie in. And I know Kyrie and Luka weren't super successful as a duo over the second half of the season post-deadline, but I do think there's a lot of potential still there with that backcourt. The offense in particular can be phenomenal. They've just got to add some better defenders around those guys. That's the big mission now that you've got Kyrie back. And also, it felt like there really weren't any suitors out there that would take Kyrie away from Dallas if they offered him any significant amount of money. There was rumors that he might take meetings with some other franchises, like maybe the Lakers, try and get him in a sign-and trade. You know, maybe the Phoenix Suns, some people talked about, which a Suns beat reporter almost instantly shot down. After the James Harden news came out, some people speculated that maybe he tries to go over to Philly and there's like a 3-team deal of some sorts there. But in the end, he just goes back to Dallas to stay with Luka Doncic, which I think is the right call for both him and Dallas. Now it's up to the Mavericks to put more talent around their backcourt. And Dallas began trying to do so by bringing Seth Curry back to the franchise after being away for a few seasons on a 2-year deal. We don't know yet how much money it is, and that is the case for a few of these contracts that we'll get into later. But Seth Curry is back in a Dallas uniform where he really kind of kick-started his career, it felt like. I mean, he played other places before Dallas, but it felt like the Mavericks were really where people kind of became aware that Seth Curry was actually pretty good. He's an elite three-point shooter. He's going to be great spotting up in the corner or playing off of those two guards. But at the same time, again, they need defense, so Seth Curry should definitely not be the biggest addition for this Mavericks team in this offseason, but I think bringing in a 40% three-point shooter can't really hurt. Again, staying on the theme of players returning to their teams, Khris Middleton signs a 3-year, $102 million deal to remain with the Milwaukee Bucks. He stays alongside Giannis as his number 2, the number 2 that helped Giannis in that Bucks franchise win a ring back in 2021, and I think this is a fine deal for Khris Middleton. Now, I will say the injury concerns are concerning. I mean, he's been hurt at some of the most pivotal times of these past 2 seasons, and last year when he came back, he looked like Khris Middleton sometimes, but other times it was kind of a disaster. The defense really never turned the corner, and maybe this is the beginning of the decline for Khris Middleton, and this contract could look really bad in a few years, but at the same time, it was a necessity. The Bucks could not afford to lose Khris Middleton. I'm sure Giannis wants him back, so you've got to keep Giannis happy. You don't want to risk any potential trade request or just upsetting your franchise superstar, one of the best players in the league. an all-time great player on your roster. You don't want to risk anything that could cause him to want to maybe end up leaving your franchise at some point soon. So you've got to bring Chris back to kind of keep that championship window open. Now the next goal is to bring back Brook Lopez, who did not sign at all today. And right now it still seems like it's probably either the Bucks or the Rockets that bring in Brook. And the Rockets spent a lot of money. We'll talk about them in a moment. So maybe Brook isn't as viable for them at this point, even though they do still have the cap space. So maybe he ends up taking more money from the Bucks and staying there as they keep that championship core together. And I do think bringing back Chris Middleton is a good step in the right direction for Milwaukee. Speaking of players staying with their original teams, albeit this one is more surprising, we had Kyle Kuzma return to Washington on a 4-year, $102 million deal. This was unexpected. I really thought Kuz was going to chase a bag somewhere else, whether it was from, say, an Indiana, it was from a Sacramento, although the Kings option quickly became apparent that that wasn't an option anymore when they signed Harrison Barnes to a big extension, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. So maybe Kuz just decided that Washington was the best spot for him. He still got paid. I mean, again, $102 million over 4 years comes out to roughly a little bit over 25 mil, and that's a pretty good contract for Kyle Kuzma, who was really good this past season. Washington keeps a guy that's still relatively young on the roster, and if they decide to trade him down the line, that's a very tradable contract for Kuz. He gets his bag, he gets to just stay in Washington where he's been for the past few years, and it seems like he wants to be. Washington still has the option to trade him down the line if they want to, because that contract is really solid for him. It's a big win-win for both sides, even if, it was somewhat unexpected. Also happening with the Wizards, they traded Monte Morris over to the Pistons pretty late tonight in exchange for a second-round pick, just getting off of Monte Morris's money. They create a trade exception if they want to try and do something with that. I don't know if they actually will, but it's still an option, and they get an asset for a player that really did not have much of a role on this team anymore with, multiple guards now being in the equation. Jordan Poole comes in. You've, of course, got Tyus Jones as well. It just seemed like Monte Morris was probably on the way out. The Pistons, meanwhile, out of guard, which maybe means the end for a guy like Killian Hayes over there in Detroit. Now I want to take a quick intermission to talk about one of those deals that I didn't like as much. I mean, every deal that we've talked about I thought has been fine and it's made sense, but this one doesn't, and it's the Fred VanVleet deal. I'm sure you're not surprised that I have a little mini rant for this one. I'm sure a lot of you came to this video looking for my reaction about the Fred VanVleet signing 3 years, $130 million to the Houston Rockets. It's a max. It was the first max given out of the day to anybody. It's $43 million roughly annually for Fred VanVleet to Houston. And we knew Houston was going to spend the money somehow. The rumor was that originally it was going to be James Harden, maybe Dylan Brooks, who still is in play. He also did not sign today. Maybe it is still Brook Lopez taking up part of that money. James Harden eventually was out of the equation, so it became pretty clear that Fred VanVleet was going to choose between Toronto and Houston, and apparently that's the decision it came down to at the end, until the Rockets offered him that 3rd year. And I hate it. I hate the signing. I mean, I want to give a shout to Fred VanVleet. He went from undrafted to getting this bag. And something I want to say in this video is that just because I don't like a contract doesn't mean I'm not happy for a player. I'm stoked for Fred VanVleet. He gets to bring his family generational wealth playing basketball. Like, that's incredible. I'm not at all ragging on the players for getting these deals. But in terms of what it brings to the table for Houston, I just don't get it, for a lot of similar reasons as to why I didn't get the idea of them bringing in James Harden in the first place. I just don't understand the appeal of bringing in a point guard who seems like he's on the decline for a massive contract when you just drafted the guy who's supposed to be your franchise point guard going forward in Amen Thompson. It just does not make sense to me. At least with Harden, he's like a franchise legend kind of situation. But with Fred VanVleet, you bring him in for an absurd amount of money that is the most he's ever made, coming off a really rough season where he shot like 39% from the field. The defense was really inconsistent, and I know he dealt with injuries. He played a lot of minutes, and there's a good chance he's better over there in Houston. But what does this bring to the table for you? Sure, I guess you're going to be better at this point because Fred VanVleet is going to be the best player on your roster, but does he get you up to the 12th seed, the 11th seed? He doesn't get you to a playing team, in my opinion. There are way too many teams that are way better than Houston. I mean, you look at the team that Fred VanVleet was part of over there in Toronto, they didn't even make the playoffs. Like, they were a playing team just right there in the fringes. And this Houston team is significantly worse. Even if they add like a Dylan Brooks or a Brook Lopez still in free agency, this team is still significantly worse than that Raptors team, in my opinion. They had Pascal Siakam, who is an all-star, all-NBA type of guy. OG Anunoby, one of the best defensive wings in the league. Like, that roster was better than this Houston team. So what does this do for you? And also now, what? You're going to be paying Fred VanVleet $40 million for the next 3 years. Is Amen Thompson just going to continuously come off the bench? Are you maybe going to try and slot him as like a playmaking forward at some point? I don't know if that's the best way to do so. Relegate him to like an off-ball thing. How does this affect Jalen Green? I do think his playmaking and his shooting is going to help some of the guys on the roster, like Jabari Smith Jr. is going to be in a lot better spot going forward. But I just don't know. I don't understand the appeal of committing this much money to a player that raises your ceiling right now, but at the same time, that ceiling is, I don't even think, a playoff team, and he's just going to take minutes away from a guy in Amen who you're supposed to be developing as your next franchise point guard. It just baffles me. And the amount of money, too, like, I don't think the Raptors were offering him $43 million a year. And if they were, you should have just let him walk and instead went for like Dylan Brooks. I mean, you could have even traded a second-round pick for Monte Morris if you wanted a stopgap point guard for the moment. Sure, Fred VanVleet is a lot better than Monte Morris, but you would be giving Monte Morris like $9 million for a year, and maybe Amen Thompson's ready to take the reins at the point guard next season, as opposed to now being locked up with a Fred VanVleet contract that's $40 million for the next 3 years. You're going to have to work on extending guys on this roster sooner than later, and now you have this on your books as well. I just really don't understand it. I think there's way better ways they could have used their cap space. Again, shout to Fred VanVleet for getting the bag, and I do think he makes them better. But overall, in the grand scheme of things, I just don't think it makes much sense. I understand that OKC owns their pick. I mean, I'm a Thunder fan, so I completely get that. So there was no real incentive to tank, but at the same time, like, it's top 5 protected, and I don't think you should, kind of dig into that sunk cost fallacy where you're like, okay, well, we've got to accelerate this timeline because we don't own our draft pick. No, you need to do what's best for your franchise, and I don't think this is it. So that was the mini Fred VanVleet rant, and now let's talk about another guy that I think got overpaid. It's Jerami Grant. He's a Thunder legend, and he was good this past year for the Blazers, but he gets 5 years, $160 million, about $32 million a year for Jerami Grant, who again is good, and I think he's an exceptional player that fits on a number of teams, but that's $32 million a year. And again, I've been so vocal on this channel that I think it's time for the Blazers to blow this thing up and rebuild, and instead they're committing $160 million to Jerami Grant, who is good, but he's never been an all-star, and I don't know, I guess this is their first move in, I'm sure they're hoping a couple, to try and convince Damian Lillard to stay. But I don't know, like, they didn't make any other moves today. The only other thing they did was cut Trendon Watford, which was confusing because he's a young player that was on a fine contract that I thought was decent for them this past season. And if they're trying to, go this route of keeping young players on the roster while also trying to keep Dame like it seems like they're trying to do, why would you not keep a guy in Trendon Watford who, again, is not making much money and has looked solid at times? I just don't quite understand it. I don't know what the Blazers are doing. I mean, I know they're trying to keep Dame and I guess try and compete. I just don't think signing Jerami Grant to this massive deal is a good way to begin that. It locks up a lot of their financial flexibility. Even if they make a big trade now, like, they're going to be so close to that second apron between Damian Lillard making like $60 million, Jerami Grant making a bunch, Anthony Simons is on a big contract, whoever they trade for. Like, I mean, I guess maybe Simons is involved in that trade, so I guess that money just kind of swaps. But, again, I don't think the Blazers should be going down this route, and it's a lot of money for Jerami Grant. Let's quickly take a detour into the extensions before we get back into the signings. The first one was Kristaps Porzingis extending for 2 years, $60 million with the Boston Celtics. I like that a lot. $30 million is great value for Kristaps. And like I mentioned in my 2 videos I made about the Celtics trade, I think Kristaps is a perfect basketball fit over there in Boston. I expect that Jaylen Brown's big contract extension is coming sooner than later. We haven't gotten it yet. Let me go ahead and double check Twitter. That has not popped up because it's possible now. It became possible, by the way, at midnight today on the East Coast, so we saw a couple of those that we'll get into in a moment, but Jaylen Brown has not signed yet. I'm sure he will at some point, and the Celtics are poised to potentially be the best team in the East next season. You also add Tyrese Haliburton signing his extension, 5 years, $260 million, an absolute bag for Tyrese. Again, like I said earlier, super excited for all these guys. I mean, Tyrese is 23 years old. That's how old I am. And now he's making $260 million to play basketball, which is super cool. Big bag for him. Some people are talking about it being an overpay on the timeline, but in my opinion, Tyrese is going to be a perennial all-star type player. He's the franchise cornerstone for the Pacers. You got to give him that type of money, and I think Tyrese will play up to, if not better than that contract pretty soon. You've also got Desmond Bane getting 5 years, $207 million. This one I'm a bit shakier on just because, Haliburton is like your franchise cornerstone, like the guy. Desmond Bane is kind of like your third player, but at the same time, he's one of your young cornerstones. For a Grizzlies team that's been one of the best teams in the West the past few seasons, I think you have to give him this type of money. And I do think Desmond Bane can become an all-star, and with the cap continues to rise, numbers continue getting higher. I don't think this deal is that bad for Desmond Bane, so shout to him for getting this money for the Grizzlies, locking up their young core of Desmond Bane, John Morant, and Jaren Jackson. Long-term going forward in the future, they've got a super bright future ahead of them as a trio and as a franchise. Also, in kind of extension news, even though it's not technically an extension, the Pelicans declined Herb Jones' team option yesterday to today sign him to a longer-term deal, which functionally works as an extension. He gets 4 years, $54 million, which I think is great value for Herb Jones, a young player who could potentially outplay this contract, is already one of the best young perimeter defenders in the league. I think this is great. I think he fits well on what the Pelicans are trying to do over there. All around, great move from the Pels. One of the most intriguing role players on the entire market was Bruce Brown coming into today, and it seemed like at 6 p.m. Eastern, there were two different ways that he could end up going. One was going back to the Denver Nuggets, staying with them after winning a ring and taking a bit of a pay cut to get a bigger payday next summer, or go to the Indiana Pacers, who were rumored to be offering him a ton of money. And eventually, Bruce chose the bag, which is understandable. You got your ring, go get that payday. And he signs a 2-year, $45 million deal with Indiana, making about $22.5 million per year. A lot of people are saying that, wow, that's a bit of an overpay, but I do think Bruce Brown is incredibly valuable and brings a lot of winning attributes to whatever team he's on. We saw what he did with Denver. I think he's going to bring a lot of that same grit, tenacity, connecting type of play style to Indiana, which is a team that desperately needs that type of player. They need defense, they need connectors, and they go ahead and add a guy like that in Bruce Brown. And the second year is a team option. So if after the first year it's not working out and you don't want to pay him like $22 million next year, you just decline the team option and he ends up walking. Like, this is how you do it, in my opinion, where you bring in a veteran player that helps your young team and, improves you, but at the same time, you don't commit yourself to a bunch of money while also, locking up playtime from some of your other players. Bruce Brown fills a need that nobody else on this Pacers roster does. And now I think he could slide him pretty seamlessly into that starting lineup where you've got like Tyrese Haliburton, Benedict Mathurin, Bruce Brown, Jarris Walker, and Miles Turner. It's an interesting starting five over there in Indiana with a combination of youth, some playmaking and scoring between Benedict Mathurin and Tyrese Haliburton, some defense with Miles Turner, Bruce Brown, Jarris Walker, some connecting attributes. Like, I think this Pacers team is going to be sneakily good this upcoming year. Like, Bruce Brown brings a lot to the table. I really like this signing for Indiana, one of my favorite moves of the entire day. Losing him is a big blow to the Nuggets, who do end up signing Reggie Jackson to a 2-year, $10 million deal, which is a bit strange because he didn't play much down the stretch of the season, although minutes did just open up with the loss of Bruce Brown. DeAndre Jordan, they end up bringing him back on a minimum contract. Christian Brown is going to be asked a lot to step up into that Bruce Brown role that he kind of showed some flashes of being able to do in the playoffs this past year, but it's going to require a lot from him this upcoming year, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Nuggets try and add another name or two to fill out a bit of what Bruce Brown brought to the table. Next, let's get into some of the teams that made a ton of acquisitions, and there are two in particular that really went crazy on the first day of free agency. Those teams are the Lakers and the Phoenix Suns. Let's talk about LA first. They brought back Rui Hachimura for 3 years, $51 million. $17 million a year is somewhat steep, in my opinion, for Rui, but he was great for you in the playoffs, and you want to maintain this continuity that you've talked about all offseason and after season ended in the playoffs. You want to keep most of this core together. Maybe Rui was getting some interest from other locations, and paying him this much I don't think is that bad. He still is relatively young. He provides a lot of value to what you're trying to build as a team, and ultimately, even though it is a bit more than I probably would have paid for Rui, I think overall it's not that bad of a contract. Meanwhile, they brought in 3 new guys who I think are all intriguing pieces to what LA is trying to build. It starts with Gabe Vincent, who they stole away from the defending Eastern Conference champion Miami Heat for 3 years, $33 million. Apparently, the Heat offered about $8 million annually, and the Lakers ended up upping that offer, taking him away from the Heat. I like this signing a lot. His shooting was a bit up and down over the course of the regular season, but he showed in the playoffs that he can get hot and turn it up at that moment. He's a feisty guy at the point of attack. I think he's going to be really good on this Lakers roster. And with the open threes he's going to get off of LeBron James, Anthony Davis, Austin Reeves when he comes back. He hasn't officially signed, but he's going to be a Laker going into next season. I think he's really going to thrive over there in the Lakers system. I love the idea of adding an offensive spark plug like him. Also, Taurean Prince, picking him up for 1 year, $4.5 million. A bit of a do-it-all wing who I think is going to to fit seamlessly into the role that Troy Brown played, who they ended up letting walk to Minnesota. The two guys end up switching spots. We'll talk about him later when we talk about the Timberwolves, who also were very active on today's market. So I love the idea of adding Taurean Prince, a bit of a bigger wing for that roster. And finally, they had Cam Reddish, who is a young wing that has gone to a couple of stops and never really stuck. Maybe the Lakers are finally the spot where he figures out his potential that he definitely seems to have. He's shown so many flashes of defending at a high level, of scoring at a high level. It's just a matter of putting it all together. Maybe LA is the spot, playing alongside again like LeBron, Anthony Davis, working with Phil Handy, who's done a great job in developing the young talent over there in LA. Maybe this is where Cam Reddish finally sticks. And I don't mind the Lakers at all taking a chance on him. If it doesn't work out, then he just doesn't play too much and he's one of the deeper bench guys in your rotation, which I don't think is that bad of an idea. Ultimately, the Lakers were one of my biggest winners of this entire day. They were active in the market. They went ahead, struck early to get these guys, and they're still going to bring Austin Reeves back. They're going to match whatever contract he gets, and they might still be able to bring back D'Lo as well, because it seems like most of the cap space that teams could have used to offer money that the Lakers might not have been willing to match is drying up. So D'Lo might come back on a cheap deal. If you can bring him back alongside signing Austin Reeves to a long-term deal, then the Lakers are going to be easily one of the biggest winners of this entire offseason. Really, the only thing I think they'd still need is another big, but there are some decent options out there, and I think the Lakers are going to figure out a way to add somebody by the time this free agency period, or at least the beginning of it, does wrap up. As I mentioned, another team that was incredibly active were the Phoenix Suns, who signed 6 players today in free agency, and we knew they had to sign a lot of guys because they didn't have a lot of bodies over there. Heading into today, there was only 6 guys under contract. It was Beal, Booker, Durant, Ayton, Cameron Payne, and Ish Wainwright. Those are the only 6 guys on the books. They had to go ahead and find some way to bring in some talent to fill out this rotation. And overall, with the severe limitations they had in terms of cap flexibility, I think the Suns did a pretty good job. Now, it's not a phenomenal rotation by any means, but I do think the players they brought in played decent roles. It begins with Josh Okogie, who was pretty good for the Suns this past season, and finally, after being up and down the NBA for a few years, seems to have carved out a role over there in Phoenix. They bring him back. They also bring in Yuta Watanabe, who is a lights-out shooter for the Brooklyn Nets, and it kind of just seemed like he probably would be a guy who ends up in Phoenix. Him and Kevin Durant were pretty close. KD has raved about him at times. He shot, I think, like 54% on corner threes this past season. He's a lights-out shooter, and he's going to get so many wide-open looks off of Bradley Beal, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant. He's going to be probably one of the most efficient volume three-point shooters in the league this season, so I love the idea of adding him to this roster. Drew Eubanks adds as a backup big. I think that's a solid signing. Keita Bates-Diop is an underrated signing. He's a really solid defensive wing who also knocked down threes at a pretty decent clip this past season. I think he's going to be a really solid fit over there in Phoenix. They needed some defense. He brings that to the table. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he was the starter for the Suns at some points over the course of this season at the 3 spot. They also bring in Chimezie Metu, who I thought was pretty solid on the Kings this past season. And finally, they're bringing back Damian Lee, who's going to provide probably some of those bench shooting guard minutes. Again, it's not a phenomenal rotation off the bench, but I do think they did a good job with the limitations they have financially in bringing in some decently impactful players who could fill some integral roles on this team. I think the Suns, just by virtue of how they did so much with so little, are one of my biggest winners again with this day. They were aggressive. They went out, they got role players that made sense, got them on small contracts, and have rounded out the rotation. Even if it still is kind of a concern, it feels like they're in a lot better spot than they were like 10 hours ago. Before we go on to the rest of the teams that made a number of moves today, let's quickly touch on the Cam Johnson contract because he got a big time bag from the Brooklyn Nets in restricted free agency today. He signs a 4-year, $108 million deal with Brooklyn to stay there as a piece of this core that they're building over there. It's a lot of money, I will say, around $27 million. For Cam Johnson is a lot, mainly because while he is younger, he's not that young. I think he's 26, 27 years old, and I think he's pretty much at where he's going to end up for the rest of his career, which is a really good and valuable player. But at the same time, again, I just don't know what the rest of the potential is with Cam Johnson, which would be the big intrigue of this type of contract. Now, I think it's going to be decently movable down the line for the Brooklyn Nets, so I'm not too concerned, even though I do think it's a lot of money to give Cam. But again, shout out to him for getting that bag. A lot of people considered him a draft reach when he was taken by the Phoenix Suns where he was, and now he's making almost $30 million to play alongside Mikal Bridges, who blossomed into a star this past season, and the 2 Phoenix Suns teammates are going to be getting paid a ton of money to be there alongside each other for years to come. Next, let's go ahead and talk about the Raptors, who, as we talked about a lot earlier, lost Fred VanVleet to the Houston Rockets, which ultimately I think was the right decision. They should not have offered him what the Houston Rockets gave him. I think the years, the money is just too much for what Fred VanVleet is going to bring to the table for that team. So instead, they go out and spend their money other ways. They bring in Dennis Schroeder to replace Fred VanVleet at the point guard spot, 2 years, $26 million, which I think is a really solid contract for Dennis Schroeder. Jakob Poeltl ends up getting 4 years, $80 million, which again, I think is a solid contract for Jakob Poeltl. It seems like they're just trying to run this thing back for the most part. We've heard nothing about them making trades with Pascal Siakam or OG Anunoby, and it seems like if they're bringing guys in for this type of money, they're going to go ahead and try and remain competitive next season. This is also bolstered by the fact that Gary Trent Jr. has reportedly, according to Chris Haynes, gotten ready to sign a lucrative extension. We don't know what that means or how much money that is, but to me that sounds like probably like $25 million for Gary Trent Jr., which is a lot. And as I talked about earlier with the Blazers, I think the Raptors should go ahead and blow this thing up. I think they should have traded Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby. They should have traded Fred VanVleet at the deadline instead of just losing him for nothing. But instead, the Raptors are here in this spot, and I guess if you're trying to remain competitive, these are good deals, but I like them a lot less when you think about the fact that they should probably just go ahead and rebuild because they didn't make the playoffs, and they're probably just going to be worse this season. Another team that probably needs to blow it up are the Chicago Bulls, and they made a number of signings today, starting with Coby White, getting 3 years, $33 million. I think that's a good deal for Coby White, and he still is decently young, so even if they eventually commit to the rebuilding path, Coby White could be a part of that team going forward, and I think that's a very tradable contract if you do end up deciding to deal him down the line. So shout out to Coby White. I feel like he kind of really found his footing this past year in Chicago, and they need guard play with Lonzo Ball hurt, so keeping Coby White around makes sense. They also committed some money to another guard in Javon Carter, 3 years, $20 million, a Chicago guy because the Bulls always seem to have a Chicago guy on the roster, or at least he's from right around Chicago. I don't know if it's directly in Chicago itself, but I do like Javon Carter for this team. He provides some defense and a defensive backcourt, if you put it out there, of him and Alex Caruso is getting you a bunch of stops. He brings some of that needed defensive punch that Lonzo Ball brought to the table, and you know, giving him $20 million isn't that much. Like some people are saying, oh, we have so many guards, but you're paying him under $7 million to be a really solid defender and maybe your third string guard, second string. I'm not really sure the way they're going to go with that rotation because Ayo Dosunmu is also in the mix. But, you know, it's not that much money, and I think he's just all around a good player, so I don't hate that deal either. These two signings come in conjunction with the news from a couple of days ago that the Bulls are re-signing Nikola Vucevic to a 3-year, $60 million deal, which I think is fine for Vuce. Again, I think they should go towards this rebuild, but that Vuce contract is decently tradable. He was good this past year. I don't think $20 million is bad for Vuce whatsoever, so if they do eventually commit to this new era and trade Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, I think Vuce could also be on the move as well with that contract. I think there would be a number of teams that would be willing to pick up Vucevic for that price. So yeah, I think solid start to the offseason for the Bulls. Maybe they eventually decide to make some trades. I think there was some reporter with Chicago that was saying that Zach LaVine is still on the market, or at least they're taking calls from, which is good. They should be doing that. We'll see what ends up happening with Chicago the rest of the way, but I thought everything they've done so far is fine. Meanwhile, the Cavaliers continue to try and bolster their roster and begin by bringing back Caris LeVert on a 2-year, $32 million deal. I think that's a solid contract. Now, LeVert is incredibly frustrating and inconsistent, but when he's on, and I do think he provides some value to that team, especially one that has basically no depth whatsoever. I think it makes a lot of sense to keep Caris LeVert over there in Cleveland. They also did bring in Georges Niang, who I like a lot for that team. They need some scoring, some outside shooting, and Georges Niang is going to bring a little bit of both to that team, and also the value is really good. 3 years, $26 million. Paying him just under $9 million is really solid in my opinion. There's also a lot of rumors that they're basically confirmed to be bringing in Max Strus. They're trying to figure out a sign and trade to do so, so I'm not going to say that's official quite yet because we haven't gotten any official reports from Woj or Shams or Haynes or anyone like that. So that's just up in the air and rumored, but it does seem like that Max Strus will eventually probably be a Cav, and that's a pickup I'll also really like. Another team who made a number of moves today were the Minnesota Timberwolves. They began by bringing in Troy Brown Jr. to replace what Taurean Prince brought to the table. 2 years, $8 million. I think that's a fine contract. I do think Prince is better, although Troy Brown Jr. is a bit younger, so maybe that's the route they were trying to go. And I think he'll be fine over there in Minnesota, although, again, I do like Taurean Prince a bit better for what he brought to Minnesota this past season. Nickeil Alexander-Walker also returns to the Timberwolves on a $4 million 2-year deal. That's good, in my opinion, bringing back Nah, who has been a couple of different places, and he's never really stuck. It seems like maybe Minnesota is the location for him, and he was really solid at some points this past season. And finally, Shake Milton. They brought him in 2 years, $10 million. Love that contract for Shea, who kind of got pushed out of the Sixers guard rotation this past season, but had some really solid moments. He's a really fun shot creating scoring guard off the bench, and that's something that Minnesota really needed. So all around, I thought they had a pretty solid day, in addition to the Naz Reid extension a few days ago, which I also think is pretty good because Naz is a great basketball player. For the Kings, they bring back Harrison Barnes on a 3-year, $54 million deal. $18 million a year is a bit steep for Harrison Barnes, but he's important to that team, the culture, I guess, what they built over there, and what they did this past season. So I do understand them wanting to bring back a guy in Harrison Barnes who did all that for them, and also maybe just none of the other big name options that they were after, like Kuzma, Jerami Grant, Draymond Green, really ever materialized. So they just go ahead and retain their guy. They also bring back Trey Lyles, who's a really good floor spacing big off the bench. I think the Kings had a solid start to free agency. For the Grizzlies, they bring in Derrick Rose as another guard off the bench for that team. They lost Tyus Jones in that trade, brought in Marcus Smart, but they're still going to be missing John Morant for a beginning of the season. So Derrick Rose is going to add a bit of depth there. We'll see if he's able to contribute a little bit more than he was for the Knicks this past season when he eventually got benched by Tom Thibodeau. The Heat end up bringing back former Miami Heat player Josh Richardson for 2 years, $5.9 million. Love this signing. I think Josh Richardson is a great fit for what they need over there and really solidly replaces what like Max Strus and Gabe Vincent do a little bit. They also bring back Kevin Love, who was solid for them when they got him at the deadline this past season. And also they traded Victor Oladipo to the OKC Thunder. Yes, Depot is back in a Thunder uniform. I'm super excited to see him back on the squad. It was really fun watching him and Russ back in his MVP days. And I don't know if we keep Oladipo, we have to cut somebody, so I don't know if it's him or like a Jeremiah Robinson Earl, whose contract did just get guaranteed, but it's like $1.6 million, so it's not that big of a deal if we cut him. Maybe it's like a Trey Mann, although I think that's less likely than a guy like Jerami. It probably is Victor Oladipo, but for now, I'm just excited that VO is back here in OKC. Super exciting. And for the Heat, they end up giving up draft compensation, which we don't know exactly what that is yet. Probably just like a future second-round pick or changing some protections on the Heat pick that the Thunder do own at the moment. And with that, they open up a bit of space close to the luxury tax threshold, and also they get a $9.5 million trade exception, which they could use to acquire another piece. In one of the more unexpected deals of the day, the Magic bring in Joe Ingles on a 2-year, $22 million deal. They bring in a veteran presence who can knock down some shots and play make. I like the idea of it. I'm a bit surprised that Joe Ingles wasn't going to a contender. I felt like he would probably want to play on a team like that with him getting older, but maybe he cared a bit more about being a mentor for this team. And also, $11 million, the Magic probably threw him the biggest bag out of anybody out there. So I don't mind this for either side. I guess it makes sense. It was just unexpected. And finally, I believe the last two signings that I have not talked about came from the San Antonio Spurs. Trey Jones gets 2 years, $20 million. I like that deal. They bring back the restricted free agent young point guard, who's been good for them the past few seasons, and allows them to have a playmaker for guys like Vic, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, the rest of the guys. They just keep the young core together, as well as bringing back Julian Champagny, who signed to a 4-year, $12 million deal, which is a solid value for him, in my opinion. With all that being said, I think that is every single free agency signing, trade, extension that we got up to this point at 2:22 a.m. Eastern. Where I am right now in New York City, I am exhausted. I'm going to go ahead and edit this video and get it posted as soon as possible. Please make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I put a lot of effort into this one to try and go ahead and recap everything. Again, hopefully I didn't miss any signings. If I did, please let me know in the comment section below. I hope that I didn't. Go ahead and grade your favorite team's first day of free agency. If you want my biggest winners, I think the biggest ones are probably the Lakers, the Suns, the Pacers, I think, are a big winner. All the teams that brought back their star players, like the Warriors, the Mavericks, the Bucks, the Wizards, I guess, are a winner too, because Kyle Kuzma, again, I think that's a solid contract for him. I like what Bruce Brown brings to the table. Some of the extensions with Kristaps, Bane, Haliburton, Herb Jones is a good contract. I feel like most teams did pretty well. Again, there are a few teams that went for some massive overpays, like Houston, in my opinion, that I don't think had great days. Maybe they make some moves in the next couple of days that change my mind. But yeah, for right now, those are my thoughts on free agency. I appreciate y'all watching, and I'll see y'all later. Real one, say it back.